Which stops a gun faster, fear or one woman's unshakable calm? The Silver Spoon Diner had been peeling paint and humming neon since the Carter administration, and nobody expected it to change. At 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, the place felt like a limbo built out of cracked vinyl seats, grease-stained menus, and the tired electric buzz of a city that never really sleeps. Columbus Avenue outside was slick with rain, neon signs bleeding red and blue reflections into puddles, as if the street itself had been cut open and left to shine its veins. Inside, the air carried a complicated perfume. Stale coffee burnt just past the point of rescue, bacon grease stubbornly clinging to the air like a veteran who refused to retire, and that faint sting of industrial cleaner trying and failing to convince anyone this was sanitary. To the few late-night regulars, that cocktail wasn't unpleasant. It was home. Eleanor Vance, Ellie to anyone who bothered to learn her name, moved through it with a soldier's efficiency and a ghost's detachment. Worn sneakers whispered over linoleum. Plates clinked soft as coins. Every motion of hers carried the weight of habit drilled deep. Wipe the syrup patch off a counter, refill the sugar shakers, top off the trucker's third coffee. None of it earned thanks, but it kept the wheels turning. She had been someone else once. Sergeant Vance, U.S. Army Medical Corps, the calm in the storm of Kandahar firefights. Back then, her voice could cut through chaos like a scalpel. Breathe, hold pressure, focus men. Twice her size had clung to those words as if they were morphine. But war's end, and the country that sent her out came back with nothing but paperwork and bills. A triage specialist became a waitress in a city that charged triple for air. Her mother's lungs were failing. Rent never stopped, and the calm that once saved lives was now a thin shell keeping her from breaking. At a corner booth sat a man no one noticed. Faded Cleveland Guardians cap pulled low, plain gray hoodie, jeans that had seen better days. His hands wrapped around a heavy ceramic mug, cradling black coffee like it might keep him alive. He looked like any other night drifter killing time. He wasn't. Alistair Finch, though no one here knew it, was worth more than some small nations. His name carried through boardrooms, his face occasionally graced Forbes or Bloomberg. But tonight, he was just a shadow in a booth. For decades, he'd been a surgeon of numbers, cutting fat off supply chains, optimizing until towns turned ghost white on maps. He owned a penthouse high enough to forget gravity and a fleet of jets. But he'd come here not for bacon or coffee. He came for anonymity, for the strange tonic of watching ordinary life pass by without asking him for anything. And he had been watching Ellie for nearly an hour. Finch was a connoisseur of systems, and she was a system of one. No wasted energy. When a trucker had snapped about his overcooked eggs, she hadn't snapped back. She'd simply nodded, steady as an oak, and said, "Let me fix that for you." Her voice carried the kind of quiet authority that executives tried to fake in seminars. Finch had watched billionaires lose composure over smaller slights. Ellie? She kept the emotional thermostat of the room set at cool. He found himself studying her, not with pity, but with something unfamiliar. Recognition. Her calm was forged in chaos. Same as his, only her battlefield had been literal. At 2:34 a.m., the quiet broke. The diner door slammed open, bell above it shrieking in protest. Two figures stormed in, black hoodies, ski masks, adrenaline already leaking out of their pores. The first was tall and broad, a pistol raised like he'd practiced in a mirror. The second, wiry and jittery, gripped a crowbar too tight, his fear bleeding through the eye holes of his mask. "Nobody move! Wallets and phones on the tables." "Now!" the tall one barked, his voice muffled but sharp. The trucker froze, fork clattering onto his plate. A young couple whimpered into each other's arms. Behind the counter, Sal, the short-order cook, raised his hands, spatula still dripping grease. Finch's blood went cold. His brain, trained on hostile takeovers, began mapping threats. The gunman was the primary danger, but the kid, Leo, though Finch didn't know that yet, was the live wire. Fear makes sloppy mistakes. Finch's hand twitched toward his pocket where his phone sat, a direct line to his private security team. Then he stopped. Any sudden movement could make the kid jump. For the first time in years, Finch wasn't a billionaire. He was just another man under a barrel. Ellie stood with a stack of plates halfway to the kitchen. She didn't scream. She didn't drop them. She simply went still, her body shifting into assessment mode. Her eyes swept the room, gun, crowbar, terrified patrons, exits, quick as a medic on the field. She put the plates down on a table, slow and deliberate, and raised her palms. "Okay," she said, voice low and steady. "I'm going to the register. No sudden moves. We'll get you the money." Her tone wasn't just for the robbers. It was a balm over the entire diner, a command for calm disguised as compliance. The gunman snarled, "Hurry up!" Ellie walked toward the counter, every step measured, every gesture telegraphing surrender. But Finch saw the truth. She wasn't yielding. She was taking control of the room by giving it away. The younger one followed close, crowbar shaking in his sweaty grip. His breaths came ragged, too fast. Ellie noticed. She saw the whites of his eyes, saw panic threatening to boil over. The cash drawer popped open with a ding, revealing barely $200. The leader cursed. "That's it?" "You're lying." "It's all there," Ellie replied calmly. Slow night. The trucker, emboldened by stupidity, muttered, "Why don't you just leave the lady alone?" "Sit down!" the gunman roared, spinning his weapon on him. The trucker dropped back into his seat, pale. Ellie seized the moment, turned her eyes on the kid. Her voice dropped into a whisper, soft as a hand on a shoulder. "Hey, look at me. Breathe. In and out. Slow." The kid's head jerked toward her, eyes wide. For a moment, his chest hitched, then faltered. He wasn't a robber. He was a boy drowning in a role too big for him. "Shut up!" the gunman snapped, shoving wallets into a bag. But the spell had cracked. The woman in the booth sobbed. The sound splintered the room. The kid flinched, crowbar slipping from his grip, clattering across the linoleum. "You idiot!" the leader spat, grabbing him by the hoodie. His control evaporated in that second. Ellie didn't grab the crowbar. She crouched beside the sobbing woman instead, her hand brushing her shoulder. "It's okay," she whispered loudly enough for all to hear. "It's almost over." The robbers bolted, storming back into the wet night. The bell above the door jangled frantic, then silence drowned the room. Ellie stood, body trembling now that the storm had passed. She leaned against the counter, took one long, shaking breath, then asked the only question she cared about. "Is everyone okay?" Finch lowered his hand slowly. He'd seen tycoons crumble under market crashes. He'd seen generals lose their grip. He had never seen anything like her. One waitress turning a diner into a field triage and walking every soul out alive. And he knew then, extraordinary had just crossed his path. And Alistair Finch never let extraordinary pass him by. The diner didn't so much breathe after the robbers fled as wheeze. The bell above the door gave one last rattling jangle and settled into a sulk. For a long half-minute, nobody moved. Then sound seeped back in by cautious degrees. A spoon tipping off a saucer, the neon sign's insect hum, the young woman in the booth trying to stop her sobs, but not quite catching them. Rain whispered on the windows like an old rumor returning. Ellie's hands began to shake the way a tree trembles only after the wind has passed. She pressed her palms flat on the counter, ground, pressure, breath, and counted herself back from the ledge. The trick of calm is not never feeling fear. It's keeping fear on a leash when it lunges. She had learned that in places where the ground itself sometimes bit back. "Anybody hurt?" she asked. The words came out even, nurses checklisted, though her pulse still kicked like a colt. "Think I swallowed my tongue," the trucker muttered, clutching his chest like modesty had come late in life. Sal the cook exhaled in a sharp, sizzling puff, the sort of sound a griddle makes when it meets cold water. Outside, sirens gathered. First one, then the echo of another, then two more snapping at the tail of the first. Blue and red smeared the Rain Street glass. The door banged open again, this time pushed by authority. Two uniforms with rain on their shoulders and the deadpan expressions of men who've seen the evening news from the inside. Behind them came a detective in a thrift store sport coat that failed at both warmth and style, a small spiral notebook already open in his hand. "Detective Chen," he announced to the room, as if a title could put Humpty back on his egg. "Show of hands. Who saw the whole thing?" Everyone's hands went up except Sal, who muttered he'd been blinded by onions. Statements spilled out in the orderly disorder of a post-storm creek. Too much, then too little, then one shiny detail found and held up like treasure. The couple remembered the way the crowbar clanged. The trucker remembered the gun's muzzle, which had apparently been large enough to host a barn dance. Ellie recited heights, builds, the timbre of the kid's voice, the way the leader's right foot angled inward like a bad boot had shaped it. A field report as tidy as a surgeon's notes. She did not mention steadying a room with her voice. She did not mention telling a terrified boy how to breathe. Those weren't facts. Those were choices. Choices were for her. Detective Chen's pen paused and slid again, scrawling shorthand knots. He nodded at Ellie once, a quiet acknowledgement that he'd been handed something clean. Alistair Finch, Arthur Finn, on his lips, gave his own trimmed-down version. His cap was still low, his voice pitched to plain. He'd spent a lifetime hiding in plain sight behind a different sort of armor, polish. Tonight, grease-stained linoleum served as a better disguise than any private jet. Still, as he spoke, he kept returning to the same invisible phenomenon, the way the diner had not torn itself apart. He wasn't used to being the man who noticed the weather rather than the barometer, but there it was. Calm had held, and one woman had nailed it to the floor. Paramedics came and left. They took vitals for the sake of procedure and handed out thin gray blankets that did more for nerves than warmth. The uniforms doled out little cards with case numbers, the official equivalent of "We'll keep in touch." The siren's echo faded down Columbus Avenue, dragging the adrenaline with it. When the last radio hiss fell silent, the silver spoon discovered itself again, a tired room whose paint couldn't remember being new. Sal attacked a scuff mark where the crowbar had landed, scrubbing as if the right stroke might erase memory. The couple paid in cash and left holding hands like two refugees from a storm. The trucker stared at his cold eggs as if they'd wronged him personally. Only three remained: Sal, Ellie, and the man in the cap whose coffee had gone untouched. Ellie leaned against the counter. feeling the crackle of post-crisis fatigue settling into her bones. Sand filling tracks after trains are done with them. That's when the man from the corner booth came forward. He waited until her eyes found his, until the air between them thinned enough for true speech. "You all right?" he asked. "Or just answering to the job?" "Bit of both," she said. "You need anything?" Only to say something plain. He took the cap off, not all the way, enough that his face seemed to step into better light. Up close, the eyes were a clean, winter lake blue, the kind that looks straight through polite lies. "My name isn't Arthur Finn." "Okay," she said. Her voice didn't rise to meet the revelation. The world was full of men who weren't quite who they said. "It's Alistair Finch." The name slid onto the counter like a coin nobody recognized. Ellie's expression remained undisturbed country, patient fields, no wind. She didn't read the papers much anymore. Newspapers bring bills with them, and billionaires seldom came for hash browns. "It's not important who I am," he added, a line rich men favored when their names were important everywhere else. "What matters is what I saw." "What did you see?" "I saw the temperature in a room spike, and one person bring it down without raising her voice. I saw triage without a gurney. I saw a young man about to loose the wrong kind of panic, and you put his fear back in its cage. In my world, people get paid a fortune to give seminars about half the thing you did on instinct." She stared at him a second, then let her eyes wander to the clock above the pie case. The second hand hopped forward with a sound too small to matter. "I just wanted everybody to go home," she said. He nodded once, as if someone had finally handed him the part of the map that shows the scale. From a pocket, he produced a small flat case of black titanium and slid a white card onto the counter. No gilded edges, no adjectives, just a name, a title, and a number that wasn't the front desk. The logo, interlocked Fs, looked like two roads crossing and refusing to part. "Come talk to me tomorrow," he said. "Not about what happened here. About what you can do when the ground opens under people. I'm standing up a new arm of my company, money with a job instead of a headline. I need somebody who understands crisis as work, not spectacle. Somebody whose first questions are the right ones, and you think that's me." "I don't think." He tapped the edge of the card with a forefinger that cost more per hour than most cars. "I know. I can pay for your time. A day's wages for a talk, whether you walk away or not." She almost smiled at the phrase, a day's wages. In his world, a day probably bought a sailboat. In hers, a day might keep an oxygen tank humming. "Why me?" she asked. "Because the army teaches you to check your corners." "Because character shows when the script tears," he said. "Tonight I watched the script tear. You didn't look around for applause. You looked around for wounded silence, came and sat on a stool and ordered nothing." Rain ticked against the glass like a cashier counting change. She touched the card with 2 fingers. The paper had that expensive, toothy quiet to it, the feel of a thing certain of itself. She slid it into the pocket of her apron, behind the check pad and the stump of a pencil. "I open at 11 tomorrow," she said. "If I don't come, assume I chose hash over your kind of trouble." "I'll assume you chose sleep," he said, and the corner of his mouth conceded a near smile, as if he'd forgotten how. He settled a thick tip beneath his untouched coffee and left as quietly as a thought you intend to remember. When the door closed, the bell made a modest, almost grateful sound. Sal whistled low, a single-note verdict. He looked like trouble the good kind, if you can afford it. "I can't," Ellie said, and flipped the open sign to closed, an act the sign took personally. The city wrung itself out before dawn, and by the time Ellie made it home, the rain had traded places with a sky trying to remember blue. Her apartment was 2 rooms and a hallway that believed in ambition. The wallpaper had surrendered long ago. The radiator hissed like an old cat. On the small table beside the worn sofa sat her mother's concentrator, plastic tubing coiled in a patience loop, the steady whisper of machine breath rising and falling. The sound had become the metronome of the household. Her mother, Helen, slept in her chair the way some people sleep on duty. Cheeks hollowed by years, hands splotched with the sort of brown that life paints when it's had a long talk with the sun. She woke at Ellie's step and pressed a smile into place like a woman setting a hairpin. "You're late, lamb." "Work ran long," Ellie said, because truth sometimes needed a sweater. Helen's eyes, still the clear green that had caught Ellie's father back when steel made more promises, traveled to the damp hem of Ellie's jeans, the tremor in her hands. "You all right?" "Fine." Ellie knelt to check the concentrator, then the pill organizer, then the blood pressure cuff. "How's the chest?" "Dusty barn." "Mornings it opens, evenings it creaks," Helen said. She watched her daughter with a gaze that missed less than people suspected. "Something's got your mind's tail." "What is it?" Ellie pulled the white card from her pocket and set it on the table. The interlocked Fs caught the weak light and made something of it. Helen leaned forward. "Well," she said softly, "that's a door." "Maybe," Ellie said, "or a painted wall." "I don't know." "You'll knock," Helen said, casual as a recipe. It wasn't a question. Mothers, the good ones, don't often traffic in doubt when it comes to their children's backbone. "Job like that isn't for me." "Why not?" "Because it'll be all suits and speeches and cameras. Because rich men don't hire women like me unless they want a mascot. Because I already have a full time with you." Helen's laugh was more air than sound. "You can carry me and carry more. I've watched you carry a whole anger you didn't put down, even when it wasn't yours. Don't confuse exhaustion with fate." Ellie sank onto the ottoman, elbows on knees. The quiet of the room, the concentrator's whisper, the old clock's stubborn tick, the building's bones sighing, made a kind of honest music. She looked at her hands. They were strong, a little scarred, too clean for a soldier, too rough for anybody's idea of fortune. "What if it's a trick?" she asked, surprising herself with the child note that still lived in her. "Then you'll see through it," Helen said. "You were trained to see through worse." Ellie didn't answer. Her eyes slid to the little stack of envelopes on the counter, white with red reminders, polite as threats. She thought of the kid's breath hitching behind the mask, of a room full of strangers steadied with a small voice. She thought of the way the billionaire had said it, character shows, and how she'd wanted to contradict him but could not find the objection. When sleep came, it came like truce. She woke to the phone buzzing itself brave against the kitchen table. A voice with professional vowels announced itself as Clara, Mr. Finch's assistant, and asked if 1 o'clock suited. A car, she added, would be at the curb at 12:30, and if Ms. Vance had any dietary restrictions, the driver could accommodate. "I eat what shows up," Ellie said, "because humor is a rope you throw yourself sometimes." At 12:30, a black sedan the size of a small promise pulled up to a curb that had rarely hosted anything fancier than delivery vans. The driver wore a suit that fit him like memory and held the door as if doors mattered. Ellie had dug out her one good blouse, ironed within an inch of its patience, and black slacks whose seams remembered a better day. She kissed her mother's forehead, cool, papery, loved, and told the concentrator to keep honest time. On the ride downtown, she watched neighborhoods pass the way, pages turn, the sagging porches and patched asphalt giving way to glass cliffs and steel that didn't apologize for shining. The city, seen from a sedan, looked like money talking to itself. Seen from a bus, it sounded more like a prayer with one eye open. She pressed her palm to her knee to keep it from bouncing. Her reflection in the tinted window looked like a woman halfway between two lives, and not entirely convinced she'd been invited to the second. The car nosed up to a lobby where Marble had forgotten it once lived underground. Security men with polite smiles checked her name and found it already waiting in the system, which unnerved her more than a gun had the night before. The elevator was a sealed silver idea that rose without effort. Floors fell away like scales from a story. When the doors parted, she stepped into a room that could have been an observatory if stars were made of people. Floor-to-ceiling glass framed the lake like a painting you could walk into. The furniture was spare and expensive in the way that says, comfort costs extra. Air smelled faintly of citrus and new decisions. The carpet accepted her worn heel click without comment. Alistair Finch stood with his back to the view, which is how you can tell a man has seen it too often. The cap and hoodie were gone. In their place, a charcoal suit tuned to his frame by someone who did more with a needle than most surgeons. He looked like a man who had never once had to wait for anything except, perhaps, himself. "Miss Vance," he said. His voice in that room sounded like a contract finally out of draft. He gestured not to the throne of a desk, but to two chairs set as if for a conversation no jury would overhear. She sat. He sat. The quiet between them felt honest, like the space between breaths when you're counting. "You still only want to talk?" she asked. "For now," he said. "What you did last night, people will call it bravery. I call it competence of the rarest kind. I don't have a line item for it. I need one." She felt the old ache in her shoulders lift its head, the part of her that had once been stationed where the world broke. She didn't know what he'd offer or what he'd want. She only knew the door was open, and the room smelled like a chance bigger than rent. He slid a folder across the low table. Not thick, not theatrical. It made a soft sound, like a book agreeing to be opened. She rested her fingertips on it and looked up. "All right," Ellie said, the old sergeant's steadiness returning to her voice like a friend late but welcome. "Show me the problem." Outside, the lake threw light back in at the sky. Inside, two people who had nothing in common but a single Tuesday at 2:34 a.m. began the kind of conversation that rewires a life from the fuse box up. The morning after the diner incident dawned in that half-hearted way Cleveland mornings often do. Gray sky sagging low, the streets damp enough to suggest rain, but not committed enough to cleanse them. Eleanor Vance pulled her thrift store jacket tighter around her shoulders as she trudged home from the overnight shift. The sidewalks still smelled of fryer grease and last night's arguments, with the faint sweetness of early blooming lilacs trying and failing to cover it. Her apartment waited 3 flights up in a building that should have retired sometime during the Carter administration. The stairwell smelled of boiled cabbage and old newspapers. The hallway light flickered like it had developed stage fright. By the time she pushed open her door, Ellie was operating on nothing but fumes and muscle memory. Inside, the single-bedroom unit bore the marks of too many battles with bills. Secondhand furniture polished to a sheen of survival. Walls that had surrendered their paint in patches, and an oxygen machine humming steadily in the corner like an old dog guarding the room. Her mother, Helen Vance, slept fitfully on the couch. The machine hissed and clicked, every cycle reminding Ellie why she worked nights pouring coffee for strangers instead of finding some mythical 9 to 5 that would never tolerate her sudden exits for emergency hospital visits. Ellie placed her tips, 37 crumpled dollars and a Canadian coin, on the counter next to the stack of envelopes marked Final Notice. She stared at them, wondering how paper could feel heavier than bullets. In Afghanistan, weight meant something you could lift, move, or bury. Here the weight was invisible but everywhere, pressing down in ways no medic training had prepared her for. She brewed herself the cheapest coffee from the bottom shelf of the discount store, the kind that tasted like burnt rubber bands but at least smelled like forward motion. When she sat down at the scarred kitchen table, she pulled out the business card from last night. White, heavy stock, a minimalist logo embossed so cleanly it seemed to sneer at her chipped nail polish. Alistair Finch, Chairman, Finch Enterprises. The man who'd nursed his black coffee in silence, who had watched her diffuse armed panic like it was just another Tuesday, and who had offered her, what? A conversation, a job, a way out? Ellie stared at the card the way one stares at a stray dog, suspicious, cautious, but also secretly hoping it might follow you home. She thought of the police report, the flash of red and blue lights, the young detective scribbling her statement, while clearly wondering why she had been so calm. She thought of Finch standing there afterward, peeling off his disguise like some magician revealing the trick wasn't sleight of hand, but sheer audacity. Her first instinct was to laugh it off. Billionaires didn't recruit diner waitresses unless they wanted a headline or a hobby. She knew charity cases when she saw them. Her own life had been proof enough. But there was something in Finch's eyes that unsettled her. Not pity, not amusement, but recognition. As if he'd been waiting for someone like her, though she couldn't imagine why. Her mother stirred, coughing, a raw rattling sound that made Ellie's chest seize. She hurried to adjust the oxygen mask, her medic's hands as steady as they had been under mortar fire. "You're all right, Mama," she murmured, brushing back gray wisps of hair. "Just breathe." When Helen's eyes blinked open, clouded but sharp enough to notice the worry etched across her daughter's face, she whispered, "Don't look so haunted, Ellie." "You survived worse," Ellie forced a smile. "Yeah, but worse never came with utility bills." By the time her mother drifted back to sleep, Ellie had already made her decision. She slipped the card into her pocket like contraband and dialed the number. The voice that answered wasn't Finch's, but Clara's, professional, brisk, and terrifyingly efficient. Within minutes, Ellie had agreed to a meeting scheduled for the next afternoon. Clara promised a car would pick her up. Ellie hung up feeling like she'd just signed enlistment papers again, her stomach knotting in the same mixture of fear and strange electric hope. The next day, the car arrived. Not a cab, not even the kind of black SUV that blended into city traffic, but a German sedan that looked like it had rolled straight off a glossy magazine cover. It parked in front of her building, its polished paint job reflecting her neighborhood's cracked sidewalks and boarded-up shops like an unkind mirror. The driver, in a suit so crisp it could cut glass, opened the back door for her. Ellie hesitated. She glanced up at her apartment window where her mother's curtain twitched. the silent reminder of why she was doing this. Then she slid inside. The interior smelled of leather and a hint of something citrus and expensive. The seats cradled her like they knew secrets. Through the tinted windows, she watched her block dissolve into the city proper, the transition from forgotten storefronts to gleaming towers unfolding like time-lapse footage of two Americas stacked against each other. By the time they pulled up to Finch Tower, Ellie felt like she'd been transported not just across town, but into another universe. The building loomed, a monolith of glass and steel that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The entrance alone could have paid her mother's hospital bills for a year. Marble floors polished enough to shame the sun, a chandelier shaped like frozen lightning, and security guards who scanned every arrival with professional suspicion. Ellie straightened her thrift store blazer, trying to look like she belonged, though she suspected everyone in the lobby could smell the diner grease still lingering in her pores. "Miss Vance?" Clara appeared as though conjured by the building itself. She was all sharp lines and polished efficiency, her smile practiced yet not unfriendly. "Right this way." The elevator ride was disorienting. Unlike the rickety clattering lifts Ellie was used to, this one ascended with eerie silence. Her ears popped. Her reflection in the mirrored walls looked both smaller and larger than she remembered. She clasped her hands to hide the trembling. When the doors opened, she stepped into Finch's office. It was less an office and more a temple to capitalism. One wall was nothing but glass, revealing the city stretched out like a model train set, Lake Erie shimmering at the horizon. The air carried a subtle scent of cedar, polished steel, and the faint ozone tang of expensive electronics. The floor was so clean it felt like walking across someone's idea of perfection. Alistair Finch stood at the window, hands in his pockets, posture loose but commanding. He turned as she entered, his expression unreadable. Gone was the diner disguise. Here was the billionaire in his natural habitat. Tailored suit, posture honed by years of power, eyes sharp enough to slice through excuses. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice calm, resonant, and carrying the faintest note of curiosity. "Thank you for coming." Ellie swallowed the dryness in her throat and stepped forward, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished floor. "Have a seat," Finch gestured, not to the enormous desk that screamed authority, but to a pair of leather chairs arranged at an angle. The choice itself was deliberate, a signal he wanted conversation, not interrogation. Ellie lowered herself carefully into the chair, aware of the soft hiss of leather against her thrift store slacks. Her fingers interlaced tightly in her lap, the only clue betraying her nerves. She had faced mortar fire without blinking, but the sheer weight of this room pressed harder than shrapnel. Finch sat opposite her, elbows resting on his knees, studying her with the detached intensity of a scientist examining a rare specimen. He wasn't leering, wasn't unkind, just unrelenting. "You must be wondering why you're here," he began. "I am," Ellie admitted, her voice low, steady by habit. "I'm a waitress, Mr. Finch. I serve coffee. You run an empire. The math doesn't add up." A faint smile ghosted across his lips. "I saw the way you handled a gun pointed at you, Miss Vance. That wasn't a waitress talking. That was command under fire. And I'm interested in command." Ellie resisted the urge to look away. "I did what anyone would have." "No," Finch said, shaking his head slowly. "I've seen what anyone would have done. They screamed. They panicked. They froze. You didn't. You managed the emotional temperature of the room. You found the weak link, the younger boy, and neutralized him with words, not force. My executives pay consultants millions to learn a watered-down version of that skill. You have it naturally, and that makes you valuable. The word valuable landed heavy. In her world, valuable usually meant overtime hours, double shifts, and the quiet math of survival. Here, it sounded like currency with too many zeros. Ellie crossed her arms lightly, not defensive so much as protective. You don't know me. You saw 20 minutes of my life. Finch leaned back, steepling his fingers. I know enough, and I've done my homework. Clara, seated discreetly at a side console, slid a thin folder across the desk. Finch opened it with the precision of a man dealing cards. Eleanor Vance, age 32, Akron-born, U.S. Army Medical Corps, 2 tours in Afghanistan, commendations for bravery, honorable discharge 6 years ago. Since then, 3 service jobs, 2 apartments, 1 mountain of medical debt, a mother with severe COPD. You are surviving, Ms. Vance, barely. And yet, when chaos hit that diner, you behaved as though you'd been waiting your whole life for that moment. The recitation felt like a scalpel, cutting away the thin layers she kept between herself and the world. Her jaw tightened. You don't get to reduce me to a file. Finch's gaze sharpened. Then show me more than what's in the file. Tell me why. The room went quiet enough that Ellie could hear the faint hum of the oxygen machine echoing in her memory. Her instinct was to stay silent. Medics knew the power of silence, but his eyes pinned her. He wasn't a robber with a gun, but he was dangerous in another way. He could decide her future with a flick of his wrist. She exhaled. I was trained to stay calm because panic kills. If I panicked in Kandahar, a patient died. If I panicked, my unit went home in bags. Last night wasn't heroism. It was a muscle memory. That's all. Finch studied her for a long beat, then nodded slowly. Muscle memory is the most expensive commodity in the world. It's why armies function. It's why CEOs keep their jobs. And it's why I want you. He rose, walked to his desk, and pulled out a single crisp document. He placed it in front of her. This is an offer. Director of Field Operations. The Finch Initiative, a new foundation I'm building. Salary, $250,000 a year. Full medical coverage for you and your mother. Housing stipend. A team of your choosing. Your job would be to design and implement crisis response programs in communities left behind by the kind of progress my company has too often created. Ellie blinked at the paper. The numbers blurred, her brain refusing to accept them as real. She thought of her mother's stack of bills, the smell of hospital disinfectant, the way hope had shriveled to a fossil inside her. That's insane, she whispered. It's practical, Finch countered. I've spent 3 decades optimizing supply chains. Now I want to optimize redemption. I don't need another economist or analyst. I need someone who has lived through chaos and knows how to tame it. That's you. Ellie pushed the paper back toward him. Her hands shook now, not with fear, but with something more dangerous, possibility. Why me? You could hire someone with 3 PhDs and a Rolodex of nonprofit board contacts. I don't want theory, Finch said simply. I want reality. Your reality. Silence stretched. The city outside the glass wall glittered like an indifferent audience. Ellie thought of the boy with the crowbar, his wide eyes, his ragged breath. She thought of the calm she had forced into her own lungs to reach him. And she thought of the way Finch had watched her, not as a billionaire dabbling in charity, but as a man measuring a rare equation. Her heart hammered. And if I say no? Finch shrugged, though the steel in his eyes didn't waver. Then you go back to the diner. Your mother's bills pile higher, and I'll find someone else. But I suspect we both know you won't say no. It wasn't arrogance, it was certainty. And that certainty scared her more than the gun ever had. Ellie stared at the offer again. It wasn't just numbers on paper. It was air. It was dignity. It was a way to stop merely surviving. Her throat tightened. When do I start? Finch allowed himself the faintest of smiles. You already have. The lab at Sterling Dynamics no longer felt like just a workplace. It was a minefield disguised in glass and steel. Ellie stood alone under the harsh white lights, the hum of servers filling the sterile air like a mechanical heartbeat. To most, the screens glowed with indecipherable symbols and cascading equations. To her, they were breadcrumbs, the trail of a thief who had stolen not only her work, but years of her life. She scrolled through logs, line by line, her eyes narrowing at inconsistencies the way a field medic once spotted hidden hemorrhages in wounded soldiers. Numbers that should have been random repeated like lazy lies. Entire simulation runs were time-stamped before the equipment had even been powered on. Anyone else might have skimmed past it. Ellie felt her stomach tighten. Kendrick, she muttered under her breath. His name tasted like iron. The realization hit with the slow burn of certainty. He hadn't stumbled into error. He'd built a cathedral of deceit, brick by forged brick. A knock on the glass startled her. Finch stepped in, still wearing the armor of his immaculate three-piece suit. But his face betrayed fatigue. Blue eyes dulled from hours of investor calls, lips pressed thin from conversations where moneymen questioned his judgment. You've been at it all night, he said. His tone wasn't reproach. It was closer to reluctant admiration. Ellie didn't look up. He doctored entire runs. Not mistakes, scripts, code designed to erase anomalies. Its deliberate Finch came closer, scanning the screen. His world was balance sheets and boardrooms, but he grasped enough to know she wasn't crying wolf. His jaw tightened, that tick of a man forced to admit the empire he'd built had termites in its beams. And Albright? He asked carefully. Ellie hesitated, her hand hovering over the mouse. She opened a buried folder, its name innocuous, but inside were lab notes signed by Albright himself. Footnotes matched Kendrick's discoveries, verbatim. She remembered writing those derivations, late nights when coffee and fury were her only companions. Seeing them now, scrubbed of her name co-signed by men who had erased her, was like finding her own fingerprints at a crime scene staged against her. Her throat constricted. He knew, she whispered. He's been feeding Kendrick everything. Maybe even Hayes Finch swore softly, a rare crack in his polished exterior. He pulled a chair beside her, not above her, and for the first time, they sat as equals, two people staring down the depth of betrayal. What you're saying, Finch said slowly, is that my entire company was rigged to fail. By my own people, Ellie met his gaze. Not just fail, implode. They wanted to turn you into a cautionary tale, and me into nothing. The weight of it hung between them. Outside the windows, Manhattan glittered indifferent, a million lives moving forward, unaware that the future of green energy was dangling on threads of deceit. Days blurred into nights. Finch worked the investors, assuring them progress was steady. Ellie lived in the lab, hair pulled back in a loose knot, eyes rimmed red, chasing shadows in data logs. Gavin, Finch's head of security, quietly doubled surveillance, but he didn't need to tell Ellie. She already knew. One evening she caught sight of it. A black sedan parked across from her apartment, windows tinted, too dark. It idled for an hour, then slipped away when she turned on the lights. She mentioned it the next morning, voice flat, as if reporting a lab result. "They're watching me," she said. Finch didn't flinch. "Then they're afraid." Ellie pressed her lips together. "Afraid people will finally see the truth." But truth was fragile. Already, whispers crept through the press. Rumors of instability in Sterling's hydrogen project, analysts speculating about flawed science, investors tightening their wallets. Ellie saw headlines calling her the mystery waitress, questioning whether she was Finch's pawn, a fabricated narrative to deflect failure. Each article was a paper cut, small but stinging. She fought the urge to slam the laptop shut. Instead, she stared at her reflection in the screen. Not a pawn. Not anymore. One night, exhaustion dragged her head onto the lab desk. She dreamed of Kandahar, the dust, the blood, the impossible quiet after mortars fell. She woke with a gasp, breath fogging the screen. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. Then she saw the code still glowing, steady as a pulse, and forced herself upright. She found it at 3:12 a.m., a discrepancy so precise it couldn't be accidental. A simulation from 6 months back showed a perfect curve of energy efficiency. Too perfect. She dove into raw machine logs and found the truth. A spike of uncontrolled gamma radiation buried under a subroutine labeled sensor error. Her fingers trembled. She'd seen that spike before. In her corrected math, the one Albright had dismissed. It was the flaw that turned green hydrogen into a bomb. Ellie leaned back, staring at the ceiling tiles. Kendrick hadn't just ignored it. He'd built a program to erase reality itself. Her chest tightened with anger so sharp it bordered on grief. She thought of the young engineers in the labs, bright-eyed kids who believed they were building a future. Of her mother, lungs failing, who believed the world her daughter once dreamed of might still arrive. And of herself, years ago, crushed under threats and lawsuits, too broke to fight. No more. She copied everything to a secure drive, slid it into her pocket, and left the lab. The city outside was wet with rain, neon bleeding across puddles. She walked fast, heart hammering. Halfway home, she stopped, sensing eyes on her. A man leaned against a lamppost across the street, cigarette tip glowing. When she looked directly, he turned away, too quickly. Her fingers closed around the drive in her coat. The evidence felt like a talisman, but also a target. By the time she reached her apartment, she was trembling. Not from fear, but from the adrenaline of someone who knew she'd crossed the line between hidden and hunted. In the dark silence of her small kitchen, she whispered to herself, "This isn't just my fight anymore." That was when Finch called. His voice was low, urgent. "Bring what you found," he said. "Tomorrow, the investors meet again. If you're right, this changes everything." Ellie looked at the drive in her palm, its plastic casing unremarkable, but inside it was dynamite. She thought of Kendrick's smug face, Albright's dismissive sneer, Hayes's empire built on ruin. Her lips curved, not into a smile, but something fiercer. "Then let's light the fuse," she said. The boardroom was too polished, too clean for the kind of truth Ellie carried in her pocket. Sterling Dynamics had spared no expense. Floor-to-ceiling glass, mahogany table gleaming under recessed lights, skyline glittering beyond the windows. But beneath all that shine lurked rot, and Ellie knew it. She stood near the door, drive clutched like a secret she wasn't sure she should share. At the head of the table, Harrison Finch adjusted his cufflinks with the mechanical precision of a man who'd built an empire one contract at a time. His investors flanked him, Davenport, with his silver hair and faint smell of old money, Tanaka cool and unreadable, eyes sharp behind rimless glasses. Kendrick was already there, his smile strained, fingers tapping nervously on the table, as if each beat could erase his guilt. Finch caught Ellie's eye, a subtle nod. Now. She stepped forward. The room shifted. Men in suits, used to commanding worlds, turned their gaze on a woman in a simple blouse, hair pulled back, dark circles under her eyes. Not the face of power, not until she opened her mouth. "I reviewed the data," she said, her voice steady. "The formula you've been shown is wrong." "Deliberately wrong," Kendrick scoffed, loud enough to cover his own quickening breath. "This is absurd." "She's a waitress turned amateur scientist." "Harrison, really?" "Sit down," Finch cut him off, his tone glacial. "Let her finish." Ellie laid the drive on the table. For a moment, it looked out of place. Plastic and metal on polished wood, David daring Goliath. The logs show anomalies erased by custom code, spikes of uncontrolled energy disguised as sensor errors. If that formula is implemented, your paradigm shift ends with an explosion. People will die. The words fell heavy, undeniable. Davenport shifted in his chair. Tanaka's eyes flickered for the first time. Kendrick laughed, high and brittle. "Fabrications. Anyone could doctor a log file." "Not anyone," Ellie said quietly. "Only someone with access to the R&D servers. Only someone who signed those runs." She tapped a key. The screen lit up with raw logs, streams of numbers scrolling faster than most could follow. But the anomalies blinked red, undeniable as bloodstains. She pulled up the subroutine, the code Kendrick had written. His initials tucked arrogantly into a comment line. Finch leaned back, eyes locked on Kendrick. "Care to explain why your fingerprints are all over this deception?" For a heartbeat, Kendrick's mask cracked. Sweat gathered at his temples. He opened his mouth, shut it, then forced a smile. "This is misinterpretation." But Ellie wasn't done. She clicked again, opening the encrypted folder she'd fought half the night to unlock. A ledger filled the screen. Cryptocurrency transfers, neat and damning. And $5 million funneled from a Cayman account. The recipient, Robert Kendrick. The silence was suffocating. Davenport's jaw tightened. Tanaka muttered something sharp in Japanese. "Still misinterpretation?" Finch asked softly. Ellie's hand hovered. Then she clicked one final file. An audio recording filled the room, Kendrick's voice unmistakable, plotting with Hayes, selling Sterling's downfall in exchange for patents and profit. In Albright's name, her old mentor, spoken like a devil in the dark. When the recording ended, Kendrick slumped in his chair, color drained from his face. He looked small, pitiful, the arrogance stripped away. "You don't understand," he whispered. "They promised. Albright said it was the only way." "No," Finch said, standing slowly, his height casting a shadow across the table. "You don't get to hide behind promises. You sabotaged this company. You endangered lives, and you tried to bury the one person who saw through you." His gaze flicked to Ellie, and for once his voice softened. "She saved us. You tried to destroy us." Kendrick lunged suddenly, not with logic, but with desperation. His hand darted for the drive, for the one piece of plastic that spelled his end. But Gavin, the head of security, moved faster. In seconds, Kendrick was face down on the glossy floor, wrists cuffed, his shouts muffled by the carpet. The room exhaled. That night, Ellie stood by Finch's office window, looking down at Manhattan, its lights shimmering like nothing had changed. But everything had. "You know what happens now," Finch said quietly, joining her. His reflection in the glass looked older, harder. "The press will circle like vultures. Hayes will deny. Albright will lawyer up. Kendrick will sing to save his own skin." Ellie nodded. She should have felt triumph. Instead, there was only a hollow ache, the strange grief of vindication. Years ago, she'd walked away broken, silenced. Tonight, she had proved herself right, but it came with the sour taste of betrayal confirmed. "They'll come after me too," she said. "Discredit me, smear me. Turn me into the problem instead of the solution." Finch's jaw tightened. "Let them try. You've already done what none of them dared. You told the truth when it mattered most. That makes you untouchable." Ellie gave a short, tired laugh. "Untouchable? I've been broke, fired, erased. I'm not untouchable, Mr. Finch. I'm just too damn stubborn to stay erased." Finch looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing not just the scientist she had been or the waitress she had become, but the survivor who refused to be either. "Then maybe," he said, his voice quieter, "you're exactly the partner I need." By dawn, headlines screamed across the city, "Sterling scientist arrested in corporate espionage scandal." Kendrick's photo was everywhere, eyes wide, face pale, the fall of a man who had thought himself untouchable. Ellie closed the newspaper and set it aside. The world was finally catching up to what she had known all along. But the battle wasn't over. Hayes still moved in the shadows. Albright still wore his tenure like armor, and she was still the woman the world doubted. Yet as she looked out at the city, sun spilling gold across glass towers, she felt something shift. For the first time in years, she wasn't running from the past. She was running straight into the fire. And this time, she wasn't alone. The storm did not end with handcuffs in the boardroom. If anything, Kendrick's collapse was the spark that lit the bigger fire. By morning, the headlines weren't polite whispers. They were a roar, each news outlet sharpening its teeth on the carcass of Sterling Dynamics. Corporate espionage. 5 million in crypto. Whispered names of rivals. It was the kind of scandal that sold papers and tanked stocks. Ellie watched it unfold from the corner of Finch's glass-walled office, a cup of coffee cooling in her hands. She'd spent 6 years hiding in plain sight, invisible behind aprons and diner counters. Now her name was being dragged across the same screens that once ignored her existence. The irony would have been funny if it didn't feel so heavy. Finch stood at the center of it, fielding call after call, his voice sharp enough to cut steel. He had lived his life building walls of control, but even he looked shaken now, his tie loosened, his hair a little out of place. Money had always been predictable, risk calculated, percentages tidy. But this was chaos with a human face, and it unnerved him. "Davenport wants assurances," Finch said, hanging up with a thud of the receiver. "Tanaka is threatening to pull his stake. Hayes is already leaking statements about baseless accusations. Albright." He stopped, jaw tightening. "Albright's pretending none of this touches him. He thinks tenure and ivory towers will keep him clean." Ellie sipped her coffee, bitter on her tongue. "And Kendrick?" "In federal custody," Finch said. "He's bargaining." Men like him always do. The only question is who he throws under the bus first. Ellie stared at the skyline. Dawn was breaking, bleeding pink light over steel towers. It should have felt like victory, but it didn't. The truth had teeth, And once it was loosed, it didn't just bite the guilty, it bit everyone. The emergency board meeting was convened that afternoon. They gathered in the main conference room, 60 floors up, the city spread beneath them like a map of sins. Davenport sat stiff, his cane angled neatly against the table. Tanaka's expression was colder than the steel of the building's beams. Other investors dialed in, faces flickering across screens mounted like judges above the tribunal. Finch stood at the head of the table, but this time he wasn't alone. Ellie sat to his right, still wearing the same simple clothes, her presence jarring against the suits and silk ties. She had no title, no shares, no reason to be here, except the truth she carried. Davenport adjusted his glasses. Harrison, you've dragged us into a firestorm. Billions on the line, reputations tarnished. And now you bring her. Who is she to lecture us? Finch didn't flinch. She's the reason you still have anything left to salvage. Without her, you'd have signed your names to $100 million catastrophe. If you want to understand what you've invested in, you'll listen to her. The room bristled. Old money didn't like being told to sit still by anyone, least of all a waitress from nowhere. Ellie felt their stares, sharp as knives. For a moment, the old instinct rose, the urge to shrink, to vanish. But she remembered the diner, the gun barrel, the boy she'd calmed with nothing but her voice. Fear didn't win then. It wouldn't win now. She leaned forward, her hands steady on the polished wood. 6 years ago, I discovered a flaw in the formula you've been shown. I reported it. I was silenced. That same flaw is in Kendrick's work, and he knew it. Albright knew it. Hayes paid for it. If this project had gone forward, the result wouldn't have been green energy. It would have been an unstable chain reaction capable of killing people. And you, she looked each of them in the eye, would have had your names on it. Silence thickened, heavy as smoke. Tanaka finally spoke, his English clipped but precise. You have proof? Ellie slid the drive across the table. All of it. Logs, code, payments, recordings. Kendrick was sloppy or arrogant. Take your pick. The investors bent toward the evidence like men examining relics, afraid to touch but unable to look away. Finch broke the silence. You wanted assurances? There they are. Not of safety, but of betrayal. We can bury this, deny it, spin it, or we can face it, clean it out, and build something worth more than the mess Kendrick sold us. Davenport's cane tapped once against the floor. He looked at Ellie, really looked, and for the first time his eyes softened. And you? What do you stand to gain in all this? Ellie held his gaze. Nothing, except the chance to stop a lie before it kills people. I don't want your money, I want the truth on record. It was the kind of answer men like him weren't used to. For them, everything had a price. But honesty, raw and unpolished, unsettled them in ways greed never could. By evening, the Department of Justice had Kendrick in a box, and he sang like a choir boy with a knife at his throat. Names, dates, transfers, all of it spilled out. Albright's fingerprint smudged across stolen research. Hayes's company traced to the Cayman shell. What had been suspicion hardened into conspiracy. The press ate it like wolves. Albright, once a darling of academia, found himself dodging cameras on campus, his lectures drowned by protest chants. Hayes snarled from the cover of financial journals, denying, deflecting, but each denial rang thinner than the last. Kendrick, meanwhile, was a broken man, trading loyalty for leniency, his arrogance dissolving into pitiful pleas. Through it all, Ellie walked a strange line. Some called her a hero, others a fraud. Talk shows debated her motives, her past, even her clothes. But inside the walls of Sterling Dynamics, her presence grew undeniable. She was no longer just the waitress who whispered in a billionaire's ear. She was the voice that had dragged truth into the light. One night, after the chaos of another news cycle, Finch found her in the lab. She was at a whiteboard, equations spilling across it like poetry only she could read. He watched her for a moment, silent. Then he said, "They're going to remember this as my scandal, but the ones who matter will remember it as your vindication." Ellie capped the marker, turning to face him. "Vindication doesn't pay hospital bills. Doesn't bring back the years I lost." "No," Finch said. "But it gives you something better. The chance to decide what comes next." He placed a folder on the table. Inside was a new charter, Rossi Sterling Innovations. Her name inked in bold beside his. Equity, authority, responsibility, not charity. Partnership. Ellie stared at it. For so long, her life had been survival. One shift, one bill, one disappointment at a time. And now here was the chance to step back into the world she had once dreamed of, but on her own terms. She closed the folder gently, like it might vanish if she pressed too hard. "If I say yes," she said, her voice low, "it has to mean something. Not just another project to pad portfolios." Finch met her eyes. For once there was no boardroom polish, no billionaire armor, just a man who had seen the cost of his own blind ambition. "Then we'll make it mean something," he said, simply. The reckoning came in waves. Federal charges filed, Albright stripped of tenure, Hayes indicted. Sterling Dynamics weathered the storm, battered, but afloat, because one woman had refused to stay silent. And when the dust settled, Ellie stood at the center, not as a waitress or a forgotten graduate student, but as a scientist, a leader, a survivor. She had walked through betrayal, danger, and ridicule, and come out forged, not broken. The city glittered outside the lab windows, the hum of machines steady around her. For the first time in years, she felt not like a ghost haunting her own life, but like someone alive in it. The world would write headlines, spin stories, and eventually move on. But for Ellie Rossi, the real ending wasn't in the papers. It was here, in the quiet promise of a second chance. And this time, she intended to take it. 6 months later, the world had already moved on to fresher scandals. Markets rose and fell, new faces grinned on magazine covers, and the name Kendrick was just a footnote in lectures about corporate greed. But inside a renovated building on the edge of Manhattan, the story had only just begun. The Rossi Sterling Innovation Center buzzed with a life Ellie had once thought she'd never touch again. Sunlight spilled through glass walls, glinting off equipment she'd chosen herself. Whiteboards filled with equations stood beside humming prototype reactors. Around her, young scientists scribbled notes, argued theories, laughed over coffee. It wasn't perfect, no lab ever was, but it was hers. Ellie stood by the pilot reactor, watching data scroll across the monitors. Efficiency climbing, stability holding. It wasn't just science, it was vindication written in numbers and decimals. She felt the quiet thrill of being back in her element, of ideas blooming faster than fear could catch them. Finch walked in, his suit traded for a lab coat that still looked oddly regal. He carried 2 mugs of coffee, set one on the counter beside her. "We've got Tanaka flying in tomorrow," he said. "Davenport the day after. They want progress reports." Ellie smirked. "They'll get them. And for once the numbers aren't lies." Finch studied her for a moment, then nodded. There was no need for speeches. Their partnership had grown beyond words. He trusted her, and she, against all odds, trusted him back. Later that night, when the lab was quiet, Ellie lingered by the window. The skyline glowed, a constellation of ambition and ruin. She thought of the diner, of the boy with the crowbar, of the whisper that had stopped a billionaire's pen mid-stroke. Strange how life could pivot on the smallest hinge. Her phone buzzed, a text from her mother. "Breathing better today. Thinking of you, my brave girl." Ellie smiled, tears stinging her eyes. For years, she had lived like a ghost. Now she was flesh and fire again, carrying not just her own hope but the weight of a mission bigger than herself. The world would keep forgetting, keep moving. But in this place, with these people, she was building something that would last. And as long as the lights burned in the lab, the story of a waitress who whispered the truth would never really end.